Well, I just wanted to welcome people to the Global Justice Report. This is an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, and I'll be your host for today. The Center for Global Justice, or El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website. Today's program is the 33rd one that we have given since June 1. Our webinar today is on the expanding the commons, democratic public goods. The failures in the US response to the pandemic, which Nancy was referring to, have made it painfully clear that we need a robust public health care system, universally available to all, regardless of employment or income. That is, we need Medicare for all as a public good. Similarly, the efforts to undermine the post office have made us aware of the importance of this long-standing public good. There are many other familiar public goods that we take for granted. Public libraries, public schools, parks, streets and highways, even sidewalks are among the many benefits available to us all that we take for granted. Some are administered by government, whether national or local, some by voluntary community groups. They are as American as apple pie. While similar to public goods in some ways, the commons can be understood as resources or institutions that, beyond the market and the state, are controlled and managed with active participation by the people involved, such as by communities, workers, or users, thus pointing the way to social and ecological transformation. How can we expand such shared resources? Well, Nancy Holmstrom and Dario Azzellini are with us here today to explore the ideas of the commons and public goods and their relevance to our lives. Nancy is a philosopher who will unpack the ideas of public goods as the core of a democratic society. Sociologist Dario Azzellini will look at current movements around commons in the context of class struggles and a just transition. Many public goods have been threatened with privatization by special interests that aim at profits for themselves. We have to struggle to preserve institutions that benefit everyone rather than a few. The resources we all share are often vital to our lives. At least they contribute to a fuller, enhanced life. And today, we are becoming increasingly aware of their value to us. Well, I want to give the floor first to Nancy Holmstrom, a philosopher, who will be delving into some of the concepts that undergird our discussion today. And after her, then we will have Dario Azzellini. And following that, then we'll have a Q&A session. So, Nancy, let me give the floor to you now.
In just one day last week, we lost more Americans to the coronavirus, 3,055, than were killed in the September 11th terrorist attack or in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet when we think of the word security, we think of protection against those kinds of intentional threats. That's the way the term security is commonly understood. But true security, protection against all kinds of threats to our well-being, whether intentional or unintentional, must be understood more broadly. True security requires that we expand the commons and democratize public goods. Whether it's pandemics or global warming, the most deadly threats we face are not intentional ones. The word commons and public goods have been used in different ways. Cliff defined them slightly differently than I will. But essentially, for our purpose here, public goods, the commons, or common or collective goods, or common stock are just different terms for describing what is essentially the same idea. Historically, in England, the commons referred to land on which commoners had the right to graze their sheep, forage for wild goods, and collect firewood. They lost these century-old rights through the process called the enclosure movement, when the commons land was made private, enclosed by fences and hedges and protected by laws, hence violent. Not surprisingly, the commoners saw the enclosures as theft of their land. Each one of them lost his or her individual right to use the land. The most radical resistors to this process were known as the diggers, who argued that private property was an obstacle to the freedom of all, which required communal property. The earth was a common treasury to us all. Similar processes occurred around the world then and today as people lose access to lands that had been held communally for centuries. This happens wherever capitalism extends its reach into non-capitalist regions, whether in a geographical sense or in a similar but not identical sense, when capitalism extends into new sectors of society. Laws are then changed or reinterpreted to lend legitimacy to the threat, to the theft. The justification given for this in the Americas was that the land was terra nullius, nobody's land, which was racist, of course, but it also reflects certain misconceptions regarding common property. When they say that no one owned the land, it belonged to no one, they say this because no one in particular owned the land, that is, no one person to the exclusion of the others. But common property nevertheless involves an individual right to property. If this sounds surprising, it's because this fact has been obscured by the widespread equation of property with private property. But property is not a thing, consider property in stocks, but rather a set of rights. The defining right of private property, which differentiates it from common property, is the right to exclude others. Hence the fences, hedges, and laws which constituted the enclosures. Each individual who's part of the group that owns something collectively has the right to use it, hence not to be excluded. Hence both collective and private property are kinds of individual property. The Zapatista movement, the global justice movement of the 1990s, and Occupy Wall Street all contributed to reviving the idea of the commons. Neoliberalism, with its commitment to privatization, has led to a growing resistance against the commodification of everything, including our own genetic material. There is, moreover, an increased rate of privatizations and enclosures as capital has moved from the housing bubble to speculating in land throughout the globe, joined by China in its search for resources. Today, we see the word commons used more broadly, not only for land and other natural resources, but also for the cultural, intellectual sphere as well. Communicative space like radio waves and the internet, scientific knowledge, art, literature, and music, all part of our common human heritage, contributed to and created by countless people throughout the globe, throughout history, building one upon the other. Hence, they're all collective human products, whatever the effort contributed by particular individuals most recently. The core idea in all these different examples called the commons is of some good accessible to all. So when something that has been or could be accessible to all is made private, whether it be water or seeds, medicine or music, this can be conceived as enclosure too, and many would call it theft. The fundamental question is who has the moral right to use and control these goods? Why should some have the right to exclude all others? There are also public goods like schools and medical care, not public by nature, but as a result of hard-fought struggles from below. Such public goods should be seen as great cultural achievements of the human race, much like great works of art, to be valued and protected. In some countries, like the US, these goods have never been one for all. In others, both social welfare capitalist countries and in the former communist countries, people's rights to collective goods like healthcare are under threat or have been lost. Globalized neoliberalism is destroying the idea that kinder, more humane forms of capitalism are possible. The dominant assumption in our society is that everything that can plausibly be made a commodity should be. Consider the ubiquitous water bottle. Only the remainder that are impossible or too difficult or problematic to commodify should be public. For example, a lighthouse. However, the possibility of technological solutions to these difficulties makes clear that whether or not something is a public good or not are political decisions, not facts of nature. The political continuum from conservative to social democrat is differentiated as to where on the continuum they would draw the line. Laissez-faire economists supporting a bare minimum of public goods, social democrats much more state ownership and welfare provisions, but within capitalism. Today, I contend there is an ecological imperative to reverse the priority and make public goods or common stock the default. They should always be personal property, that is, property for personal consumption. And I believe that some private property is consistent with socialism. However, it's the latter, private property, that should have to be justified. That is what it means to make common property the default. Unless there is some argument to show that particular businesses are better left in private hands or that they do no harm, think of small businesses like artisanal food, arts and crafts, repair shops, farms, etc., that they should be held in common. There are several reasons to make common property the default. First of all, the pragmatic one, that it's the only way these common goods can be preserved from profit-driven development. But there are also logical, political, and moral reasons to switch the default. When the question of privatizing something is raised, what is being considered is common stock. So both logically and temporally, common stock is prior. Furthermore, a commitment to human equality and democracy favors taking common stock as a norm. Recall that the essence of private property is the right to exclude others. Since all human beings are equal from a moral point of view, shouldn't the basic assumption be in favor of equal access to the Earth's resources and to collective products of humankind? As the digger said, the Earth is a common treasury for us all. An equal right to decide how they are used. And hence, shouldn't the burden of justification be on those who would exclude, that is, defenders of private property? And finally, shouldn't decisions as to whether or not to privatize, i.e. exclude, have to be made democratically? In the case of natural resources, even speaking of property of any kind is problematic. Marx suggested that one day the idea of ownership of the earth would seem as morally repugnant as the idea of owning another human being. Better, he said, to see human beings as caretakers of the earth for succeeding generations, as Native Americans believe for the 7th generation. The vision of a socialist society as one where the means of production are owned in common and democratically planned, Marx's vision, is far from universal on the left today. Such a vision requires state institutions at various levels of society. Many people today are distrustful of the state for good reasons and focus instead on what they call horizontal movements and on non-state institutions. This reflects a healthy democratic impulse, and such movements and institutions are crucial to building a better world. However, I contend this focus is insufficient. Mutual aid is important, but can only go so far. We need governments under democratic control to effect the massive regulation we need to control producers who are destroying the environment. Bureaucracy is inevitable only if the governments are not fully democratic, which means they need to be connected and controlled by social movements. Putting demands on government is an important way to build and unify a movement of diverse groups, workers, farmers, environmental groups, and consumers, all of whom would benefit from sustainable industries. And under capitalism, who but the government has the resources, who can provide jobs or income to workers who will be displaced when destructive industries are shut down. Consider the pipelines, the workers and their consider the workers and their labor unions that support the building of gas pipelines because they need the jobs. Many of the pipelines that are proposed go near or under rivers and are highly likely to pollute the waters and the land. Obviously, this is very harmful and highly irrational from a social point of view, but the workers are caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Corporations too face structural constraints from the market system. If an individual corporation tried to do the right thing rather than the most profitable in the short run, they would violate their responsibility to shareholders and have to change their policy very quickly, as British Petroleum did. So the decisions must be taken from their hands. Others today focus on democratic ownership and control at the level of enterprises, but within a market system. But the crucial question is the relative power of the market within society. Most importantly, worker-owned enterprises cannot solve the multiple ecological crises we are facing. They are constrained by the same political and economic forces of the competitive market to continue producing the same stuff in the same way. If British Petroleum had been owned by workers, would that have made a difference? Even many prominent environmental thinkers seem to accept the logic of capitalist reproduction. They call for reliance on renewable energy sources rather than fossil fuels, but fail to mention that we also need to reduce growth. Though sustainable energy sources are renewable and sustainable energy sources are essential, we need to have a broader perspective. Even if we switch to cleaner, greener cars, for example, if we continue to produce ever more cars, the resources and materials for building, maintaining, and transporting them would cause more pollution than we have at present. Thus, whatever their markets there are in socialism have to be brought under the control of institutions of rational democratic planning. At what level should the planning be done? That all depends. A focus on the local is very important. There are many inspiring examples of economic planning on the local level, like participatory budgeting developed in Brazil and the agroecological practices of La Via Campesina. However, many things simply cannot be accomplished in towns or cities or regions or even countries. We need national clean air regulations, or else states will compete for business by lowering environmental standards. And the same is true on an international level. Marx said in the German ideology that socialism in one country was impossible. How much clearer that should be today. Climate problems do not respect national borders. The whole planet shares the air. Deforestation in Latin America affects our air in North America and contributes to melting the polar ice caps. Dirty water leads to contaminated soil, that leads to contaminated food, which is then exported around the world. That's why climate scientists call for planet-wide curbs on emissions, and ocean scientists say we need a 5-year plan to save the oceans plundered by overfishing. Nor do the human and political problems engendered by climate problems stay within national borders. Consider unemployment due to depleted resources on land and in the ocean, wars over scarce resources, and the millions of refugees fleeing across the globe as a result. Many of these social catastrophes particularly victimize women. Thus, we need more institutions of international governance, that is, planning and regulations, such as the United Nations of Socialist Societies. The issue is not whether planning is local or centralized, I contend, but what kind of institutions enable rational democratic control from below. The failures of state planning in the so-called socialist bureaucratic systems do not discredit planning as such, but undemocratic planning from above, planning by and for the bureaucratic ruling class. There are some positive signs. More and more people see the immensity of the ecological crisis accentuated by the pandemic and are involved in a myriad of struggles. The left, too, is catching up. Many appreciate now that the ecological crisis and its corollary, the pandemic, is the best argument against capitalism that there is. Along with massive popular disgust with politics in the US, there's also a renewed interest in openness to socialism. What is meant is unclear, but primarily it's social democracy. That is, reforming capitalism in a social welfare direction. Exactly what has been under attack for several decades in Europe. It's true that this is better than nothing, and what else is possible, one might ask. Certainly revolution is off the table, but that depends on what one means by revolution and how one conceives of it happening. If what I've been saying is right, and a thoroughgoing revision, the transformation of our political economic system, starting with the expansion of public goods, is necessary to save the planet, what else is that but revolution? The means to that transformation are not fixed, and then it needs to be continually reevaluated in each period. But that is what I believe we need. Thank you.
There it is. So, should
Well, thank you, Nancy. Before we go on to Dario's presentation, let me just tell you, some of you probably have questions that you might want to raise from this from her presentation, and you'll have an opportunity to do that after we hear from Dario. We'll take questions for both, but I want to tell you how to present a question, because those who are watching this on YouTube are not able to get questions to us directly. What you have to do is send an email to me, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will then relay your questions to our speakers. Others of you who are in the Zoom room will be able to present your questions directly to the speakers. But that's all for later. So now let's go on to hear from Dario Azzellini. I want, by the way, to put a plug in for his book, which is on Venezuela, Communes and Workers' Control in Venezuela. It is an excellent discussion of how to build institutions that are genuinely democratic and collective from below. He's authored many other books as well, but that one has stuck in my mind as a particularly important one. Okay, so Dario, take it
Okay,
away.
hello. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Nancy. I wrote that book, and very much of the focus of my work is on social movements and on especially on forms of local self-government and forms of workers' control. So I published a few books and edited books also about workers' control historically and in different countries. And they've been translated to different languages. And I also made a few documentaries about that. The meaning expression I like and I use. And you can find almost everything on my website, which is simply my last name, Azzellini, and then .net. Okay, so thank you, Nancy, for this overview, which was, I think, great, also including all the difficulties that there are in our present world with the comments. And since I guess that like people that would disagree too much are not present here, so that I will try to make it interesting by focusing maybe on some details where I have maybe a different view, or which I consider are especially problematic, or which differ, because that's one of the other things that we should mention. Maybe not that much in the US, but in the rest of the world, in Europe and in an international debate and in Latin America, everyone is talking about commons. I mean, you can go to the website of the World Bank and they are saying that they're promoting commons and organizing seminars about commons. And you'll find in all over the place people telling you that car sharing is kind of commons, that so I think that like when everyone is talking about commons and commoning and wants to build commons, the World Bank has even like a whole group which is supposed to be in charge of protecting and improving the global commons, yeah, and reaches out to the private sector to advance common goods. What you would say, and I mean, also listening to Nancy, so which part did we miss if you're reaching out to the private sector to protect and improve the global commons and advance common goods? There's some middle part I somehow missed in this stream of ideas. Okay, so transnational companies are telling us that they're building commons. Uber is supposed to be commoning transport. The sharing economy is supposed to be a form of commons. So I think that like a few things that Nancy pointed out about what are the commons are really important, and maybe also like to look even more in detail, what's the difference between public goods and commons? And I think that commons are public goods, but not all public goods are commons. Yes. So what would be the difference and what would be the advantage of commons? Let's just take a very simple example, and I connect it because I'm supposed to talk about the movements right now and how they are advancing commons. So in Berlin, where I lived for a long time, and I had a lot of political activism, and among others, my group promoted with others a referendum to recommunalize the electric system, which had been electric service had been privatized by or assigned for administration to private companies by the city of Berlin several years ago. So we promoted a campaign to recommunalize it. It was organized like in a huge common table, round table, where like different groups and organizations would talk and discuss about how would that look like, the recommunalization. And we finally presented a concept, or finally the concept presented, and which was supported by a broad base and alliance of different grassroots groups and leftist organizations, and etc., was that it would be like a public company, but that had to be submitted to the control of the communities. So the public company would be forced to present every 3 months a report to community assemblies of the neighborhoods, and be approved by them, and the community assemblies would have a say in what this company, how the functioning of the company would be. We promoted then a huge campaign to organize a referendum, because there is this rare opportunity, a possibility in Berlin to organize public referendum. And if you have a certain participation and you win, they are binding for the local, for the city administration, which is at the same time a federal state. So they have to turn the outcome of the referendum into a law, which is interesting because now one of the next one, I have to say that one was not successful because it did not reach the quorum of 25% participation. It was like a few hundred votes below the 25% because of the tricky campaigns organized by local politics, which then launched themselves a new company that would recommunalize everything, but without turning it into a common, obviously, and without the public community control. But so they said, well, it's not necessary anymore that you go to participate in the referendum. We're going to recommunalize it anyway. And it has been, in fact, recommunalized, which is kind of a success, but it's not under, like, did not become a common. It became just a public good again. Like I said, I think that's still a success. The referendum was won by 89% in favor, but it didn't reach the quorum of 25% participation because of these tricks of the local politicians. Another one that was won was it was a referendum pushed about the inner city airport that Berlin had and was closed down. And obviously, immediately they wanted to build whatever shopping malls and centers, and always arguing with housing, but in the end, obviously, what they wanted to build is commercial and offices, and etc. So there was a huge movement organized again for a referendum that this place, which is the biggest open space, inner city open space without buildings in the whole of Europe, would be kept like that. That it would be prohibited to build anything, and it would be like a public access park for the Berliners. And this referendum was successful. We reached the quorum. We reached the 70-something% of the Berliners were in favor. So it's there, and they're still trying. Every 6 months, they bring up the discussion again, some, especially like right-wing parties and business associations, to build there, always with the argument about housing. But it's there, and it's a law, and it can't be touched. There's another campaign that has been done. The necessary signatures have been collected. There should be, at some point next year, a referendum about the expropriation of all real estate companies that have own more than 3,000 apartments in Berlin, which would be the recommunalization of more than 250,000 apartments in Berlin, which would imply that they are paid by the city. The modalities are not clear. There are like different ideas about that. The campaign says, well, what they will get is not the market price, because there's a lot of speculation, but a fixed price that is established about the kind of value. But since they all bought these apartments from different communal housing agencies at the end of the 80s and early 90s, what we also have to do is to take off all the earnings they made over these years and then they get paid the rest. Yes, so this is the idea. Others, the right obviously argues, no, this is like billions of euros, and it would like destabilize Berlin and etc. Nevertheless, the referendum will be coming, and we will win it, because there's like a majority of 60-70% of Berliners that is in favor of expropriating these real estate companies. Their campaigns have not been successful up to now. So these are a few examples how about like in a commoning or regaining common goods on a bigger scale. What would be the difference, like the electric company, for example? Okay, it's like, imagine you have a public company. It's a public company, but it's a public company, and it acts like Nancy said about like even workers own places. It has to act according to certain laws of the market, because that's what these companies do in capitalism. So what happens if a mother or a father alone with a kid cannot pay the electricity anymore? So they'll wait 3 months, they write 12 letters, and then they just cut it off. Because that's the logic, you can't pay, they can't go into it, etc. So what about if it's now the assembly of the neighbors that has to decide if this person still gets the electricity, or if there is an alternative solution that can be found for that problem? I would bet anything that the neighbors assembly is able to find a solution that the public company is not able to find for such a problem. So this, I think, marks a strong difference also. And I agree that we need larger scale solutions, like Nancy mentioned, but at the same time, democracy means to decide where the things are happening and among the people that are concerned by these matters. So there's no way to get around local organization, local decision, and local power, because that's the root of democracy. We have then to figure out how to build like higher scale systems, or the contradiction, obviously, that there's certain things that are of higher interest, that we cannot have a local assembly deciding if they want to build an airport or not, because I mean it affects many more people. We won't have an local assembly decide if they introduce the death penalty in their community or not. Obviously, I mean, in the US it's almost like that, but I'm talking from like developed countries perspective where there's no death penalty, and obviously then in these cases you need some kind of constitution that but also have to think differently, because it should be flexible, because it cannot be that the constitution is like treated like all over the world people treat constitutions, that it's like it's graved into rock and you can't change it. This was, by the way, when the French Constitution was designed, it was a strong discussion in revolutionary France. There was quite a part of the revolutionaries that said constitutions, there's no right for one generation to submit the next generation to their decisions. And constitutions have to be, you have to be able to change constantly constitutions. And that's also, obviously, we have to, I think, change a lot of ways of thinking to get there. So one point I want to make is, so the commoning is the appropriation of common goods for a common benefit. That includes for me like occupations of land, of housing, of takeover of factories to put them to produce, workplaces that are closed down by capitalists because they follow other interests than the local interests and the people that work in these factories. And as we know from movements like in Argentina, in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Venezuela, but also now like a few cases in Italy and France and Greece, etc., the workers can continue producing in these factories. They can continue also to make a living, and they're even able often to change what they produce. So in Europe, we see that all factories that have been occupied and taken over by workers survive and change the production, for example, to ecologically sustainable production, to organic production, etc. Not only because they have a niche where they can then survive, because most of them sell also at the same time their production to prices, because they keep a class consciousness, because the occupation is a struggle. So it's not just like a cooperative where you might get confused if you're now an employer or a worker. But if you have to struggle and occupy a factory and defend it against the capitalists, then you know exactly where you are in a class society. So these workers, for example, like be it Viome in Greece or Rimaflo in Italy or Scopti in France, they try to keep prices accessible for workers' families, for example, of their organic or naturally flavored or whatever sustainable production. So we see that there are possibilities, but it has also to grow into bigger networks. But one thing that I want to make clear around that, because there's a lot of like also what I named like the liberal discussion around commons, and the liberal discussion around commons has also been able to get a Nobel Prize, like Ostrom for her commons concept. And there's one point I differ drastically from the concepts presented there, which is the question of conflict. So Ostrom presents and says that, and that's very much the liberal view of the commons, is that commons are most successful if there's no conflict. If the commoning is accepted outside and inside, and there is no conflict. So the absence of conflicts and the right of the commoners to decide and manage their own commons are neither questioned nor challenged by external authorities. And this is for them the center of successful commoning. And I would completely deny that. I would say that like successful commoning is a result of conflict. And if you want to keep your right of commoning, you have to be prepared for the conflict, because as Nancy said about the enclosure, which is, by the way, a very nice word for robbery, the enclosure was nothing else than robbery and an expropriation of the owners. But capitalism is built on that, and it still does that. Capitalism is, contrary to what we're generally told, capitalism is unproductive. It is not productive. We can see that with whatever, like in Apple or Microsoft releasing every 6 months a new update or program or whatever. You think they really like every 6 months develop a new computer or something? They just do that because they want you to buy every 6 months a new product. We see that like systems based on commons are much more innovative and much more reliable than these ones. We can go to the health sector, medicine. Like a lot of companies will not develop medicine that is perfectly developable if it's based on something that is already patented or registered by someone else, because then they can't make a business. So we can like have a million examples how capitalism and capitalist logic, intellectual property, and all these things that belong to concepts of private property capitalism are not promoting development, are not innovative. They're blocking it. So this is number one. And number two is then what is needed. Well, this enclosure goes on, is what like David Harvey then called the accumulation by dispossession. I think that continues. So successful commons will be successful on the longer term, first of all, if they find a way to also expand by dispossessing capitalism, because the problem is that they can, and Rosa Luxemburg was completely right with her critique about cooperativism and the idea that it could just extend like oil on water or something. You cannot. Obviously, if you respect life, if you respect humanity, if you respect human work conditions and all these things, you will always grow slower than the private sector. And that is also an unfortunate lesson from Venezuela, where like the state was like expropriating, nationalizing, building cooperatives, etc., and still after 10 years of Chavez, the private sector was bigger than all the other sector. Why? Well, because the private capital under any circumstances is always growing faster than other sectors that are not that ruthless. So we need the conflict to attack, to take over. We have to build and attack at the same time. We have to take over. We have to take from capital because capital otherwise will take from us. So commons can only be successful if they are prepared for conflict at any time, always, because otherwise they will be taken away. The people will be dispossessed the moment that capital needs it for its own development and surplus value creation. And there's no doubt that this moment will come because, as I said, capital itself is not a capital is it. Marx said it feeds on the living. It's not that it's something that can just like generate surplus value on its own or do anything. So the moment that anything you build as a common, anything you develop, anything will be attacked by capital, will be coming. And the other hand, in this context, the unfortunate experience with public goods that are managed by the state is that the state has been subdued to capital interests and to company interests over the past decades. So there's no reason to trust the state that it will preserve any commons or be a support in preserving the commons, which does not mean, and I studied my second PhD in Puebla with John Holloway, and I disagreed on almost everything with him, because one of my critiques was, well, I agree with your impetus about the state, but it doesn't go away just because you've ignored it. So we have to find a way to deal with it, and it doesn't. And if we are not also in the state with all contradiction that means, if we don't take it, it will crush us. And it's a complicated and very, very contradictional thing to do, but nevertheless, we have to find the ways to do that. But at the same time, we cannot rely that the state as a structure is an enemy. There's no doubt. So we have to take it, we have to be in there, but we have at the same time to build structures outside that are able to fight back and to respond, not only to capital, but also to the state's logic and the state's acting in the interest of capital and in the interest. So this is, yes, now I've been in a few points more general than on concrete examples, but I think that I mentioned a few concrete examples. I think that if we want to get to any kind of sustainable societies, there's no way around to commoning. And if you want to look it up, I published like years ago in Critical Sociology an article on labor and commoning, because I found it interesting that like everyone is discussing everything about commoning, but about the most central thing we do and we all have to do, which is labor, work, there's almost no discussion about commoning. So I try to discuss the question of labor and commoning also because it would be the most reasonable thing to do to treat labor and labor power, to be more exact, labor power as a common good, because the capitalist system wastes an incredible amount of energy, knowledge, and labor power, because it has to be bought and sold. Otherwise, and if it doesn't meet this on the market, then it's wasted. So I think that this is also another discussion that especially among socialists or Marxists should be like pushed about the question about to include labor in the whole discussion of commoning, about commoning, because we kind of do like discuss everything about commoning and about the parks and everything, but we don't touch labor, we don't touch labor power, we don't touch work, which is like the fundament of capitalism, of this society, and of life. I mean, it's the life production is based on work and on labor. Okay, I make a point here, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dario. Okay, so a workers' co-op is a labor commons, right? Okay, questions now.
Necessarily,
We're
not
ready
necessarily.
to open the floor? Oh, okay. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can get your questions to us or comments to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Just shoot me an email and I'll pass your question on to our speakers. Those of you who are in the Zoom room, of course, can present your questions more directly. Do that simply by raising your hand or waving at me. I will, you have to have your camera on. Many of you do not, but if you have a question, turn your camera on. I'll put everybody on speaker view. And if you start waving at me, I'll call on you to present your question then to either Nancy Holmstrom or Dario
Mic up.
Azzellini. See any questions yet? Okay, Judy Rosenthal.
Okay, I think commons can be preserved by people sitting down and refusing to move. In San Miguel de Allende, they are talking about turning our 100-year-old public park into putting a restaurant there to make money for the city. Local people, both nationals and expats, are planning to sit there, and so they can't do it. And it seems to me that if you have an established commons, that just a sit-down strike is very powerful. All these plans to build this restaurant were abandoned. That's all.
Great. Terrific.
Okay, conflict, as Dario was saying. Okay, Bob, that's
Hi.
you're next.
Hello.
Hi, Bob.
Nice to see everyone. So Dario
Now you're gone.
of the state, and I have a problem a little bit with that I don't have a solution for, because we have so many ecological imperatives right now that the timeline that we're talking about is very short. And I think if we're going to try and dislodge the state as a meaningful institution, we may not make those timelines. We have to deal with the imperative of growth that's inherent in capitalism and destructive to the planet. And so I'm wondering how the adoption of the commons can take place without state cooperation and bottom-up pressure, and also whether the commons are showing any more propensity against the growth imperative where you're having them in Germany.
741.
Okay, either of our speakers want to respond to either of those points?
Nancy?
I agree.
Well, to about the sitting down, I think, I mean,
Oh.
oh, you want to go? Go first.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't think about the first question. I think that's a great idea. And I agree with the second. So,
So about the first one, I would say that the level of conflict is always corresponding, or has to correspond to the interests at stake. So you might be able to preserve a park in Allende with sitting down. The people that tried to prevent gold mining in Peru by sitting down were shot, and 100 killed by the police and the military. So there is no general blueprint for like how to set up resistance or what conflict means. It's always, I think, that it has to somehow find the correspondence to the level of interest at stake. And about the second one, I'm not proposing to neither to wait or to first dislodge the state before we do any comments. I think that action on every level is necessary at the same time, from occupations, direct actions, taking over, doing things, civil disobedience, social disobedience, and all kinds of, according to the level of conflict, to using institutional mechanisms, be it a referendum, in the possibility of a referendum, using it also obviously for public campaigning and political mobilization, like in Berlin, or if you have the possibility, obviously, to take the government like they did in Venezuela. I'm not sorting out any options. And I think that, yes, right, time is running very short. That's why, like, about certain questions, and it's like about the same coalition that is bringing forward like the referendums, or many of the groups bringing forward the referendums in Berlin are part of the coalitions, for example, occupying open coal mine pits in Germany and just blocking the coal mining and blocking other harmful procedures. So I think that, like Malcolm X said, by any means necessary.
can I just add something? I think I agree with you, Dario. And I just think because time is running short, we always have to give the vision of the larger goal, the larger necessities that, and I think that models are very useful, so that we can use all the kinds of different methods that you suggested, but we have to give a vision of what is really necessary in the long run.
Let's see, I saw David Barkin's hand. David, you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Nice seeing you again, Dario.
Hi, David. How you doing?
Missed you at, I think, 2 events previously that you couldn't get onto. I think that perhaps this discussion is underestimating the extent of the commons that already exist in the world. I think here in Mexico, I think about, you know, the area that the Zapatistas occupy. They certainly wouldn't call it a commons, but it seems to me that if we look at the way in which they're managing and administering their area, and the extraordinary transformation of public sector, of what are considered to be public sector services, I think that we have to really look at it as as a remarkable extension of the concept to what's going on there. But I wouldn't limit it to the Zapatistas. We have Tosepan, which has 250,000 people in the northern part of Puebla in the mountains. We have the Sierra Juarez in Oaxaca. I estimate that there are 25 million people that are building what we call post-capitalist societies, and that there are, we could talk about the commons. Certainly, most of those have claims on very substantial amounts of territory and are working toward creating self-governance, self-sufficiency, and a diversified socio-economic and productive system. So I would like, but getting out of moving beyond Mexico, I would ask both of you to reflect on what's going on in the Mapuche world, what is going on in many of the Amazonian communities in Ecuador and Peru. Many of them are having to have very, very not violent, but very, very militant resistance to what's going on by the expansion of capital. But in other parts of the country, in other parts of the global South, this is also very, very important. I could just throw out a number that the geographers, the biogeographers have thrown out, and that is indigenous people in conservation areas occupy 1/4 of the global surface of the world. And I think that that's a very important kind of thinking about what are the kind of alternatives that are actually being constructed today and are actually in operation, and that are many of these groups are linked dynamically among each other in international organizations which have very significantly challenged the kind of views of managing these areas that the World Wildlife Conservation International has to do with. And so I would I would urge this people in this seminar to think about the commons in terms of the hundreds of millions of people who are already building and who have already built these kinds of areas throughout the world. I'll over and out.
Okay,
Well,
comments on that?
I think, you know, we could, both of us maybe have used more examples of that sort from the global South, but I don't think it's correct. I wouldn't call it post-capitalist societies because of they're enclosed, they're surrounded by capitalism, and you can't build socialism in that post-capitalism within capitalism. And in Brazil, sorry, the land that's being seized in land grabs, I mentioned that, I mean, TIAA craft, you know, which is a something that many of us get benefits from. Their investments are now more and more among land grabs, because that is it's taken over as the hot property, so to speak, after the housing bubble. And they are in they're very threatened by capitalist, worldwide capitalist interventions. So yes, I do support completely La Via Campesina and those sorts of organizations, which are combinations of these efforts. That's all.
If I have to comment, yes, I mean, yes, I agree with David on the thing that there are a lot of commons that have been preserved and are preserved, and especially in indigenous areas. Not only, I mean, if you there's I don't know the US as much, but my father's from southern Italy. I mean, you find in southern Italy obviously a lot of commons that still exists, like you find them in Greece, like you find them in southern Spain, or like in rural southern European areas where there are still a lot of commons. There are also a lot of commons in other places. The question is how. And I think that the ones that, especially the indigenous ones in the global south, are very important, and they're also the most threatened because they have so much land they are living on, and that's why wars of extermination are waged against these indigenous populations, and that's exactly one of the problems about the enclosure. So the indigenous resistance is not suddenly coming up because indigenous people decided that now it is the time to resist, but it's because they have no place to go back further. I mean, they've been like going to more remote places for like 500 years and going back and going back, and now they can't anymore. There is no other space anymore they can like retire to. So it's not even a choice they have. I mean, they have the choice to die or to set up resistance. So but I'm also convinced that we have to find the way to struggle and to fight in the centers, in the metropolis. To stop this the war machinery and the capitalist machinery, we have to hit the US, we have to hit Europe, we have to hit the systems, the political and economic systems there, and advance struggles there. And as important they are in the global south, and I've been working on them and with them most of my life, we have to the ways to support these struggles with struggles in the north, because that's what's going to be the support. Don't forget, I mean, the best times for the global south were always when, especially the US, but also Europe, were engaged in their own problems of wars and financial crises and whatever. That was like the advances that like for example, Latin America could do on what, from social welfare to building infrastructure to everything in the 30s and 40s, where because the North was engaged in war and couldn't interfere that much into the South. So we have to create a situation where the North is changing, and where we push these things in the North, and the North is not interfering that much in the global South. Again, and I think, yes, we can learn a lot of things, and we have to do a lot of things also together with the global south. And like I said, I would disagree slightly on the question if they're building post-capitalist societies or not. I think that they go into the direction of post-capitalist societies. They are able to propose certain alternatives to give a glimpse of what a different classless or post-capitalist society could look like. They can create what Benjamin called now time, or like what Bloch theorized and others, but they're not able, obviously, to build these societies because, first of all, they are under attack constantly. and I've been working also like in Zapatista regions, and one of the huge problems they have is, for example, that a lot of communities live now because of the work migration of younger Zapatista men that go and work in construction during 3 or 4 months in Yucatan, for example, in the tourist areas, and then come back with the money. Or the question that is also very contradictory is a lot of Zapatista women, for example, then form cooperatives for like doing their handcrafts and then sell the handcraft stuff outside the communities, where you could argue and say, okay, is this a progress giving the women more independence, or did you do what capitalism could not do, introduce these salary and economic relations in the communities that were not able to enter for 500 years? So and they still depend on selling them outside. I think it's great what the Zapatistas are doing. On the other hand, many other indigenous people that don't have that much attention and support like they have cannot do it because of the reason. And it's also becoming more difficult for the Zapatistas the more the outside attention goes down. And nevertheless, it's great. I'm just pointing out like problems and contradictions. I'm not saying that it's not good or great what they're doing.
I believe David had a follow-up on that. Did you have something you wanted to say in response? David Barkin.
Alejandra's been waving her hand for a while.
Yes. She was next on my list. Okay.
Well,
All
let
right.
her go first.
Let's. Okay. Alejandra.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I have sort of a question, sort of a comment, but I've been doing some research recently on surrogacy, commercial surrogacy, right? And that is something that I would say is like an example of commodification. It's the intrusion of the market into like, women's reproductive labor, and, an area that is, extending the kind of laws that have to do with property over like basically the custody of children and stuff like that, right? But it's interesting because that kind of struggle is, I think, like it's a struggle against the market and against commodification, but it's not really about the commons, and it's not really about public goods. Because if you think about it, like the reproductive labor or the individual children of, proletarian women, for example, like they do not belong to the commons, they belong to like those specific women and their families themselves, right? And so when you have surrogacy, you're allowing that to be alienated to like a capitalist company or something, but it's not going from like public ownership to private. It's like changing sort of private ownership to a different private ownership, but it's also kind of like a non-commodified private ownership, like a different kind of relationship that's not really ownership, and transferring it into something that's more like a commodity relationship. And I guess what's interesting to me is like when I've been talking to people about this, like younger socialists, I think a lot of people are very, pro like protecting public goods from privatization. But when it comes to talking about this kind of issue like surrogacy or sex work or some other things, there's a much greater sort of, I think, acceptance of like neoliberal discourses among younger socialists, where they kind of like agree that with the kind of neoliberal line that these are sort of like individual choices that, women are making, that they should be able to make. And, they're really uncomfortable with like, the state playing a role in saying like you can or can't sell this thing or do this thing with your body, because that feels like, totalitarian to them or something like that, right? So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about like whether this kind of thing is like like a different kind of struggle, or if you see it as being like the same as this kind of struggle for the commons or like for public goods or things like that. I mean, it does have to do with labor, right? It's like the having to do with like the ownership of labor, but again, it's like individual, not necessarily collective.
Well, I think that's a very interesting extension of the discussion. I think, you know, we're all are or should be part of the struggle not to, I mean, we want to resist commodification. Capitalism wants to extend, you know, I said earlier that capitalism seeks to, I'm sorry, I can't always articulate so well, into geographical space or into areas that have not been ever made commodities, such as our own genetic material or a baby. And that we have to resist that. But so I think that's part of the same struggle.
I think, yes, I mean, certain things that they shouldn't become commodities, like from genetic material to water or other things, I agree that it's the same struggle. Regarding sex work, or I'm generally against any kind of prohibition in these fields, as I'm completely against for example, the prohibition of any drugs, because they don't solve the situation or the problem. Sex is commodified. I might like it or not. Sex works, and I work with different sex worker organizations. There are some in Germany, especially one made up mainly of Latinas, which are strongly leftist and anti-imperialist, for example, and have a very interesting politics, and there are a few others, and I've been in touch with them. And I think it's not a question of prohibition. It's a question of, and often it's also not a question of choice. So I think that this is the wrong, it is not the question of prohibition or choice. It is the question of what kind of accessible alternatives they have, what kind of health and social security and services, etc., they have. And I think this is the field that leftists should work in. So not the prohibition, because this will only mean that they will continue with the work under much worse conditions. They will be illegalized, they will be marginalized, they will be not, everything they do, just even having the money will be illegal because they cannot pay their taxes, they have not the access to the services they need, etc. So the question would be like to extend collective social security for these people, like to extend whatever, certain like testing, for example, is one thing that they have, to extend mandatory testing for customers on certain issues, to provide safe places that reduce other risks you can have with these kind of work, to offer, for example, obviously, for women that don't want to continue with this kind of work, other possibilities to access to work and to education or to whatever, to offer the possibility that they can work under conditions and not for employers that are like whatever connected to violence and to other issues, etc. So I think it's a broad field. But generally, I would take like the same position about that, like about should heroin or be illegalized? Should drugs be like? Do we want to punish like the one that is doing it, or should we like? Or what do we want to have a structural thinking about it? How we change the conditions? And I don't think that prohibition makes anything go away. And I mean, my experience are it's been for 3 years in the US. And like the whole discourse in the US that is so prohibitive around everything, around sex and around drugs and around everything, created a society where most people are totally unable to handle anything. And I think, I mean, I have like students in at the university that are 20 years old and are like have as much independence and responsibility like a 15-year-old in Europe or in Latin America.
I think that Alexandra, do you want to go first, Alexandra, and clarify what the difference is, do you think, between sex work and surrogacy? Because I agree with you completely, Dario. I think Alexandra does too, about sex work, that it shouldn't be prohibited, and drugs.
I don't know if you really want to do this back and forth, but just briefly, I guess, I think that like in my experience of talking to people about this, I think that, yeah, like there are like clear policy problems with the kind of prohibition policies that have been that are implemented in a lot of places. It's been very bad for workers and hasn't stopped the trade from happening, you know? So I agree with that. But I think what's interesting to me is that like when you talk to people, and I'm really talking about people on the left, you know, the idea is not just like, oh, well, let's do this harm reduction thing, or, you know, we're trying to create better options for people, but people really start going down into this like individual liberty thing, like it's my individual right to sell whatever I want to, kind of. And to me, that's like actually a very neoliberal argument. And I think that it kind of, I don't know, I just think like trying to figure out where to draw those lines and like how to connect that to other struggles against commodification, like needs some work on the left today. That's just my.
Whatever you sell or buy in capitalism has nothing to do with your personal decision, never ever, if it's connected to work. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, it's like the people thinking like, I mean, you had these examples like of the workers are going into the factory without being beaten or chained to do that. Yes, but it doesn't mean that that it's their own decision to go and work in a factory. And the same thing happens with everything in capitalism. So I don't think that it's, yeah, I mean, like you say, it's a neoliberal argument, and it's a neoliberal argument about everything. And if we start like, yes, okay, then sell your liver, it's fine. I mean, obviously it has always something to do with like structural issues and with power relations, because obviously it wouldn't be like that if we would be all equal and we would have a society built among equals with equal access. So, I mean, there is something like personal and individual voluntary decisions don't exist in capitalist societies.
Doug Morris has a question in that was emailed in that takes this question of commodification into the cultural sphere. He points out that Bob Dylan recently sold his catalog for a reported $300 million. Tom Lehrer made his catalog available in the public domain. So our cultural heritage, is it part of the commons or is it private property?
So did Peter Seeger. Pete Seeger put it in the public domain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Karsten has his hand up. Karsten?
Okay, yes, I was just trying to unmute. So this raises so many questions, very, very interesting talks. It raises all the questions. So I almost don't know where to begin, but I have three very specific things that are actually smaller than all the questions that are going through my mind. One is to Dario, I really like you making the distinction between public goods and the commons. And that leads me to ask you to clarify a little more specifically in terms of strategic implications, how to think about what we're doing strategically when we demand the commons or when we demand public goods and how that can intersect. To Nancy, I just wanted to underscore that I really agree with your example of British Petroleum, that we could imagine it being workers owned, workers controlled, and still causing much of the same problems, maybe slightly attenuated if they were workers controlled, but maybe not, because the market system becomes the key here. And it occurs to me that the market system is not only the problem for thinking about worker ownership, it's also the problem for thinking about the commons. One could imagine a system in which there's room because of pressure for a large commons, right? European social democracy has much greater commons and public goods than does American democracy, quote unquote democracy. But on the other hand, it's still market system. And so both workers controlled and commons can be encompassed within a market system, still creating, maybe that would be a better thing, but it would create much of the same problems. And then a small point, Nancy, to you, the question of the burden of proof. I certainly agree that morally speaking, the burden of proof certainly should be on people who want to maintain private property. But it doesn't work that way in people's consciousness and strategically, because we start with what we have. And what we have is a system based on private property, market, etc. And so you can say, well, ethically, we ought to turn the burden of proof around. But I think what people need is to actually have socialists take on the burden of proof. That's a small point, but it's a difference between what is morally reasonable and what is strategically reasonable. So those are my thoughts. And I won't give you pessimism.
I agree with you, and that's why I think it's so important to have the ideological struggle, to try to change people's thinking about fundamental concepts like security, like property, like rationality. That people think that these are the background, these are the tools with which they think about these issues, and I think it's super important to make the uphill argument that we have to think about it totally differently. And so far as the distinction that Dario made between public goods and commoning that is controlled from below, I think this is terrifically important. I mean, whatever words we use. And I think that is why, I think this connects to Carson's second question. I forget exactly how it went. The struggles that led to public goods, the welfare system in Europe, also led to bureaucracy, because many is the time that there were no demands put forward for control from below by social organizations, or if they were, they lost. In the United States, at the same time that there was a demand for unemployment insurance, there was something called the Lundin Bill or Ludin Bill. I remember a talk by David Montgomery, which said that there was a bill which had very large scale support, sponsored by the left, in which there would be whether someone got unemployment insurance would be controlled by a board of workers. And that didn't win, but it had overwhelming support. And that's the kind of thing that we need and very rarely can get. Hilary Wainwright, who writes on these kinds of subjects, was in the London government of Ken Livingstone for a while as a representative of the women's movement. And what they did was, if some proposal came up, they would turn to the organization and say, how would you like it done? How would you like it done, etc. But it's very hard to keep that in control, to keep that control. And that's why they led to bureaucracies. And in some cases, people are very negative about these proposals of public goods because they associate it with just bureaucratic decisions made without taking into account people's real needs.
If I can just say something about bureaucracy, I do want to hear what Dario has to say, but while I'm thinking about it, I'm somewhat skeptical as to whether you can actually get rid of bureaucracy. I think there are some things about bureaucracy which are maybe needed, certain forms of organizational structures, certain expertise and so forth. So I tend to think, this is a point that Eric Fromm made a long time ago, that maybe the difference is that we need to think about bureaucracies which are accountable in serious ways and bureaucracies which are not. But I'm open to trying to think of how to get rid of bureaucracies, but I'm somewhat skeptical of it.
Solid administration.
Since our time is running short,
let me,
I want to give people who have questions from YouTube one more chance to get your questions in by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. We've had very few questions from there, but this is your last chance. Let's see, let me pass the floor then back to Dario to respond to Karsten.
okay, so Carsten, yes, thank you. On one hand, I think that I don't really agree with the thing that, like, I mean, yes, certain public goods and public systems. So first of all, like, the welfare system in Europe was a consequence of class struggle. It was a consequence of that communist and leftist armed mass movements in many parts of Europe were strong after World War II, and you had the alternative, and it doesn't matter what we think, how it evolved or what it was, of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and etc. That's why what happened in Europe and the constitutions and everything that was built after World War II was had large public and welfare sectors, because they had to keep the working class quiet and like somehow pacify it. The other element that is also fundamental is that it shows everything was destroyed. Capitalism is not able to develop anything, so they had to nationalize everything. Banks, railways, car industries, steel industries, everything had to be state controlled, because that's the only way to develop something. Because in crisis, capital goes always where there's most money to make. And in a crisis, it's speculation, not production. And that's what we see again. So that's why these are the two elements that brought to, like, the welfare system, etc. in Europe. And because the kind of capitalism that was built needed the inclusion of workers. And that's also one of the problems we have now with when we think about, is the state the realm where we can extend the commons, and how much guarantees, or can it guarantee the commons? I think the times of like the political model is corresponding to the economic needs. We had liberal politics, a liberal democracy, as long as the economic system needed this, like, mass production, etc., and all these things to flourish. And as long as we had that, liberal democracy was a frame to expand rights. It didn't guarantee them at all. They were not part of liberal democracy. They were all gained in struggles, but it was a frame to extend rights. This is over. I mean, we see the rising authoritarianism, because the economic model does not need democracy anymore, or participation, or mass production, or anything of that. So I think that the idea that liberal democracy is still a frame for extending rights or expanding rights is wrong, is lost. And that's why liberal democracy over the past, like at least 3 decades, has been only the frame to reduce collective rights and only extend some individual rights that are not harmful or that can extend capitalist commodification. So it's great that same-sex couples are allowed, but they are allowed suddenly because they're functional for capitalism, not because the humanity moved forward. Because like we had also a rise at the same time over the last 3 decades in physical attacks and violence against like gay, LGBT, etc. people. So it's obviously not connected to a sudden rising consciousness, but simply to a certain what is needed, what is functional and what is not. So at the same time, like regarding the bureaucracy, I think that it is the special the huge bureaucracy that was created around the social welfare states is connected to the social democratic idea, because it is the control of social processes, which is central to social democracy. So that's why I often argue social democracy and Stalinism are not that far from each other. They are very close to each other in their logic. So this is, and then you need these huge bureaucracy to control it. I think that it can be drastically reduced. I don't think that it's even a question of private or public, because I've never seen such a huge bureaucracy like in the private healthcare system in the US. I mean, it's like 10 times more bureaucracy than in any public healthcare system in Europe. I mean, it's like, it's crazy. Like what the bureaucracy that insurances have in the US, or that like even like some institutions, it's not really like connected to private or public. Can it be reduced? I think it can drastically be reduced. I think, yes, we need certain standing bodies or working bodies with expertise. The question is, do they have the right to impose their opinion because of their expertise, or do they have to make their opinion accessible and understandable for the ones that have to take the decision? And that's, I think, the main difference. And obviously, there will always be like people that know more than I do about many questions I have to decide. But I don't want them to take the decisions for me just because of that. I want them to explain to me what their expertise is and what I have to think about when I take decisions. And that's, I think, the difference between public goods and commons also. So that do others take decisions in my name, or do certain like bodies maybe exist, but just empower me to be able to take the decisions, because I know different aspects I might not have thought of, or I can discuss them collectively to get to a solution or to a result. I think that's one of the central issues. What do we have to do to enforce commons and versus public goods? I'm in favor of defending public goods. I'm not saying go to hell, and if it's not a common, I don't care. Obviously, it's also easier to communalize public goods than private goods. So I'm obviously in favor of maintaining them, maintaining public goods, regaining public goods, but also communalizing them and building commons. So what is the main difference in that? Well, the main difference in that is that building commons and fighting for communalizing means self-organization and collective discussion, and taking back the decisions in our realms, which means also that we ask, for example, for more public buildings, or more facilities, for example, for social centers, for young people, for old people, for whatever. We ask for more public access to parks and green spaces, but we don't just ask for them, we also take them. We take them and we organize them because we are organized and we defend them. And then they become public, because the law, if we look back, doesn't work like that, that something is decided and then it happens. Something happens and then the law comes to regulate it, because that's how everything always worked in these systems. So if we want a lot of green spaces turned into parks that we control, if we want workplaces that are abandoned by the capitalists to be assigned to workers, what we have to do is to take these places. So if we occupy 100 factories, if we occupy 150 areas in the city, and then ask that they become public parks, you can be sure that at a certain point they will come and make a law to regulate that, because that is how institutions and states and law functions. The community gardens in New York, they're not a result of a movement asking for community gardens. They are a result of millions, or at least hundreds, thousands of Puerto Ricans and others taking the empty spaces in the 60s and building communal gardens. And then at a certain point, they came and regulated that and installed and instituted community gardens, because the law comes always and wants to regulate what exists. So if we want something, we have to do it. We have to take it. We have to make it exist, and then it will be regulated after that.
Dario, Celia Pacheco sends her greetings to you, hoping to see you at the Workers' Economy Conference in Mexico this next year. So she just
I hope
asked me
so.
to pass that on to you.
If it happens.
And I suspect that probably David Barkin and others on this will also be interested in that Workers' Economy Conference. Richard Schmidt had his hand up a long time ago, and the discussion went on and on and on before I could get back to you, Richard. You still want to raise the point that you had earlier? Unmute yourself. We'll get the rest of the Smith Holmstrom family in on this.
Yeah.
Okay, Richard, we have you.
No, I'm sorry. I did not have my hand up. I was just reaching for something. Excuse me. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. And we're running late on time, but I saw David Barkin's hand and Joyce Carlson. So just some brief comments and we'll wrap it up. David?
It seems like a very long time ago that we talked about this, but I think that perhaps my focus on the global South doesn't fit particularly well in this conference, but in this webinar. But I really want to insist on two things that have been mentioned here. One, I think it's necessary to be a lot more careful about rejecting the notion of post-capitalist societies than you were, Nancy, in expecting that post-capitalist societies are going to have to wait until socialism comes. I think that the post-capitalist societies are here and they're constructing the basis. There are far too many hundreds of millions of people living in them right now. And they're outside the radar of most of the people who think in terms of the institutions of the global North. But I won't go further into this. But I do want to deal with the issue, a very, very important issue of the bureaucracy and the ability of communities to administer themselves in the context of the commons. I think, again, the example of the Zapatistas is quite extraordinary. We're talking about 500,000 people strong who have developed an administrative apparatus, a political apparatus to do most of the things that a bureaucracy has to talk about. But it's not only the Zapatistas. There's another group which is is practically unknown among the people who are attending this webinar today, and that's Tosepan, which is 250,000 people that have been working together for 43 years now and are doing extraordinary things that have had measurable impacts on the quality of life and the ability to resist the incursions of capitalist initiatives. I'll just stop there, Cliff, because Joyce needs to speak, and we're getting, as you said, we're getting close to time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Cliff froze. I just wanted to say I can't recommend highly enough this book I recently read by a Harvard professor called Moral Tribes. And he discusses how different tribes, he calls them, have solved the problem of morality of the commons. He's a professor of, he studies morality. Anyway, how they have solved the problem of the commons in different ways with different moral values, and how now that tribes, we're coming together, clashing, and how are we going to solve the problem of the commons all together and how to handle it. And he has a solution he calls a meta-morality. It's morality, but it's all about handling the commons. He has Joshua Green, it's backwards. Anyway, he has wonderful YouTube lectures that are short and with great slides. And he talks about the tragedy of the commons. And then that would get you interested in his book. I wish you guys, I keep wanting you guys to help me figure this out. Anyway.
Thank you. I'll look at it.
Cliff, you're muted.
Karsten is raising his hand.
I just wanted to say, I've been wrestling with this issue of how to think about democratic control and bureaucracy for a long time. And I just want to pose something to people who are sort of hopeful that we can sort of dismantle bureaucracies. I mean, we're facing a huge public health crisis. And there's a wealth of epidemiological knowledge. There's a CDC, there are public health commissions. Now, I can imagine all those things being restructured, made more accountable, but I can't imagine a situation where we just get a lot of information and all decide. But there's got to be some kind of expert organizational structure guided by priorities of people who understand intelligently what's going on, but I can't imagine them being dismantled. So I give that as an example for those who think that we can just dismantle bureaucracies in some point in the future, how you would do that for public health crises and the like. And even parks, I mean, landscape architects know a lot more about how to organize parks than I do. And of course, we don't just let them run things, but in fact, their expertise and some organizational structure may be important for the creation of something like a central park.
I think that there's different understandings of bureaucracy. I mean, of course, we need, for the examples that you gave, I think that that's not inconsistent with anything that Dario and I have said. There's a very interesting book called Demanding Democracy After 3 Mile Island. And remember, that was the near meltdown of a nuclear plant. And this woman, a working class woman, who completely bought the 3 Mile Island when it was proposed to them. And she said, well, if they just told me, what it meant, I prefer to hang my clothes on the dryer, on the line to dry rather than face this. My grandchildren are more important. So you need experts. You need experts to give information. But if people's values and preferences are let to decide without interference, I think that's more likely not to make those dreadful mistakes.
But not just information. What about organizational structures?
Oh, yeah,
like
of course.
CDC
Yeah.
and
Well, they have to carry it out. Yeah.
Yes, no, the question I was about to, thanks, Nancy, because that's exactly the thing. What is bureaucracy? I would rather like to talk about the question of power in this sense, because the central question is power. And among the many discussions I had with John Holloway was exactly about that. And I said, I don't believe you can make power disappear. Power is a social relation. It exists at the moment. Someone knows more than someone else, there is a power relation. So the question is, can I make it transparent? Can I democratize them? That's the central question, because I cannot, I won't stop reading so that I'm at a certain point and forget what I know so that I'm at the same level as my students, or to be more equal or whatever. It's like, there is a power relation. The question is, how do I make it transparent? Because I cannot often not make it not even disappear, because it like, I know many that then like, okay, behave like there is no power structure or difference between like them and their students, but who's grading at the end? It's like, so there is, so to be clear about that. One example, in Venezuela, they have and had in the barrios, in the poor areas that have to rebuild, for example, their water pipes and black water pipe system and etc. And they have urban water committees in that they built. They, at a certain point, because they didn't even have enough engineers there, they sent engineers from Cuba, water engineers, to build the water system or rebuild the water system in these barrios. And they came and had the maps of the city and then came with a certain ideas what to build. But they had to collaborate with the local urban water committees. It was good because obviously the map they had didn't have nothing to do with the reality in the neighborhood, where people had to build pipes and put things and do things and etc. Where houses that didn't exist on the map, where there were pipes that didn't exist on the map, where there were inclinations that did not exist on the map, etc. At the same time, obviously the people knew all that, but they did not necessarily knew how high has to be the water pressure to get up there and how big has to be the pipe to sustain this pressure and etc. And they worked together in a very long process to like rebuild, for example, the water pipes in these areas. And whatever happened in Venezuela, and how many critiques we want to have about that, but the access to clean water is, for example, now 96% in Venezuela, also even in poor areas. So this is the question. So the question is not that they, obviously, yes, they know more on certain things, but they also know less on other practical issues that are necessary to take the decisions to do these things. So now they don't have to go there and impose their decisions, but they don't have to say, well, I know it's like that, but they have to make transparent and explain and make the people understand why certain things are working and why others may not work, what you have to do and what you can do and what you can't do. Because unfortunately, obviously, you can't also work against a certain laws of physics. So I think this is the question: how can I make power transparent? How can I democratize power? And this is also the relation then, what are these institutions doing? What it would mean in the health sector? Well, in the health sector, I think it would mean that before having general laws about, for example, either lockdown or permitting everything, you have a communication with the different communities and look, what kind of life structures do they have? What does it mean if you like have a total lockdown in a certain place and there's no social network, for example, to support older people? Or what does it mean if you have a social, not a lockdown in an area where older people or risk groups are especially endangered and have to be in contact with others? Like, these are all questions that are necessary to take the decisions, but they can only be solved together with the community, with the expertise of the, obviously, of the experts, so that people don't have the idea, well, I cannot get infected because, I don't know, I eat gingerbread every morning, and someone else thinks, well, he looked at me, I might have COVID now. Or yeah, so these, obviously, you need the expertise, but you need to know everything is based on social structures and social interaction. There is no universalism. That's why I'm also, like, to just a few words about Joshua Green, I'm like, anything that proposes any general morality, rules, democracy, anything that is like can be generalized, I'm highly suspicious of, because I don't think it exists, because everything is based on social interaction and on different social contexts, and that's why it has to be different in every place, if even to have the same effect. Like even in the same city, I mean, in the barrios of Caracas, you have a community assembly, 20 people come, and the next day 300 know what they discussed, because they all live like openly, and they walk, and they have no streets, and they discuss and live with their neighbors. You go down to a former middle class area where people don't even earn more than in the barrio, but live the same way like in the West. So after they come from work, they close the door, they don't have any interaction with their neighbors. You have a community assembly with 25 people, and the next day 20 know what has been discussed, because 5 just came there because they feel alone and don't even know what was discussed, and no one communicates with anyone. So if you want the same type, you want the local democracy in these two places that are like 4 metro stations away from each other and 20 minutes with the bus uphill, you need 2 completely different models of local democracy to make it work. So that's why I'm completely against any universalism always. Which doesn't mean that, obviously, I'm in favor of universalisms like respect life, don't kill people, you don't exploit people, and don't have a death penalty, etc. I mean, I don't think that everything should be up to locals, but like in a more general meaning.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and obviously we cannot resolve the issues now, but there is certainly much that can be learned from the life experiences of different communities, some of which have been much more successful than others. I think we need to end now. We've gone for a full 2 hours, and I want to thank Dario and Nancy both for their stimulating presentations, and all of you for very lively discussion. Yeah, give yourself a hand. And I hope that you will be back with us for our next webinar. We're taking a vacation for the holidays. So this is the last webinar of 2020. But January 4th, the first Monday of the new year, we will be back with a webinar, Combating Racism. And I think that you will find that a very lively discussion. It will include Fred Evans, who I saw was among our group today in the Zoom room, Lewis Gordon, very prominent African-American or Africana philosopher, and myself. We'll be looking at combating racism and carrying on into the new year the challenge that has been presented in the last current year to make Black Lives Matter. So thank you once again, and enjoy your holidays.
Thank you.
This is Cliff Duran signing off.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great talks. And Alexander and Richard, good to see you. Haven't seen you for a while.
Yeah.
Yes, we saw the Holmstrom Smith family here, all gathered.
Hang with your supporters. It was really a great talk.
Yeah,
Both-
Nancy, oh, and Nancy, since I won't get to see you or probably communicate with you again because of our internet problems, but I really do want to thank you